Hey, welcome to the Grayzone. We're here with Dan Kovalik, good friend and journalist, veteran journalist, activist, and someone who's familiar with pretty much all the issues that we cover here. And it's January 6th, so happy Insurrection Day or happy Federal Security State Trap Day. Depends on how you want to look at it. But Dan is here. Dan, we met back in 2018 in July 2018 at the end of a violent months-long coup attempt in Nicaragua. We met, well, I guess in the airport on the way to Managua, and then we were there at the July 19th celebration that they have every year in Plaza de Fe in Managua, where hundreds of thousands of people come together to celebrate the Sandinista revolution, the defeat of the dictator Anastasio Somoza. And that was an especially significant day because another US-backed attempt at implementing hegemonic control over Nicaragua had been defeated. And there were not as many people in the plaza there as usual because many of the caravans from the provinces couldn't come in for fear of being attacked. And now you have a new book out, Dan, about Nicaragua. Maybe before we get started with our conversation, and we're going to have Aaron Mate on a little later at 4 p.m. Tell us about your book.
Yeah, well, first, thanks, Max. I'm really happy to be on air with you. And the book's called Nicaragua, A History of U.S. Intervention and Resistance. It's by Clarity Press. And it covers the history, about 150-year history of U.S. intervention in Nicaragua, and talks about the Sandinista Revolution that you mentioned, and does have a lot about the 2018 coup attempt in which over 200 people died, in which billions of dollars of property damage was done. And it was an event that was poorly covered, to say the least, by the mainstream press and even by most of the so-called alternative press like Democracy Now!,
Oh, yeah.
as you know.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to set the record straight about what's happening in Nicaragua, which is frankly kind of one of the, I would say, neglected, countries of the left in Latin America. Somehow people have abandoned Nicaragua, as far as I can tell. And I think that's unfortunate. So I'm hoping to help rekindle people's interest in Nicaragua and the Sandinista Revolution, which continues to this day.
Well, I remember when we were there, the left, even the part of the left now that has kind of gotten a solid footing on Nicaragua is defending the country. It was silent. And then you had the sort of Trotskyist wing of the left, the ISO types, and the, even in Jacobin, and as you mentioned, Democracy Now!, they were full on cheerleading right-wing forces, setting up barricades across the country, torturing people, killing people, surrounding police stations, and touting it as some kind of popular revolution. And it was clear, as both of us demonstrated, that the US was funding the groups that were central in organizing at least the sort of quote unquote civil society protests. And then these violent gangs were filtering in through Costa Rica. You let that take over your country and it's going to look like El Salvador in the 1990s. And Nicaragua did not let that happen. It remains still the safest country in Central America. And my friends there now tell me it's kind of boring, which is a good thing. Although U.S. sanctions are ramping up, and the Biden administration is still treating Nicaragua as part of John Bolton's troika of tyranny.
Yeah, well, I think they've imposed now, I've lost count, but certainly at least 4 rounds of economic sanctions since 2018. They most recently put sanctions on Nicaraguan gold, which I think is going to hurt Nicaragua. They've put sanctions on Nicaraguan sugar. They have financial sanctions against Nicaragua, and all this will take a toll. I mean, it's a country that it doesn't have a lot of natural resources. It doesn't have a lot of reserves to look to make up for lost revenue. So it will hurt the poor and the working class, which that's who it's intended to hurt. So,
yeah, what it does have is it has food sovereignty. And, you talk to people who support the Sandinista front, and they tell you, well, we can take the sanctions because we make our own rice, we make our own beans, we make our own beef. Primarily, we're a huge beef exporter, and the U.S. is attempting to attack Nicaraguan beef exports. They're calling it conflict beef. It's kind of absurd, but Nicaragua produces 80 to 90% of its own food, which makes it, I wouldn't say sanctions proof, but more difficult to sanction than somewhere like Venezuela, where you have an oil-based economy that had neglected its agricultural sector. And part of what Venezuela has tried to do in reorienting its economy to combat this all-encompassing U.S. embargo is to reinvigorate its agricultural economy, start to produce eggs again, for example. I'm sure you've seen that during your trips to Caracas.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. And I think we agree that the food sovereignty in Nicaragua was what got them through the 2018 crisis, because the so-called peaceful protesters, who were anything but peaceful, set up these barricades known as tranques
Yeah.
throughout many cities, and between cities. They cut off trade within Nicaragua and through Nicaragua. In fact, a lot of Central American truckers were stranded within Nicaragua for months, right, with trucks full of sometimes food or whatever that spoiled. But the point is, it was very hard to get things to market. But because they were food sovereign, people were able to get food because they were able to get it locally.
Right.
And that's probably what got them through the crisis, and it will probably be what gets them through the economic crises they're going to suffer because of the sanctions.
Well, the Biden administration is not letting up. I mean, they've taken Trump's China policy and put it on overdrive. They're trying to block semiconductor chip technology to China, and they're all on board. Jake Sullivan, NSC director, is fully on board with the great power competition, as they call it. And the Biden administration has nixed Obama's normalization with Cuba. The situation in Cuba is horrible from people I've spoken to who recently been. They say it's worse than even earlier times during this so-called special period after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Having been through Miami, I mean, it's just filling up with economic migrants, people who don't really speak an anti-communist language about what's happening in Cuba. They just tell me that the conditions had deteriorated because of the manufactured energy crisis there. Then you have Venezuela. The U.S. is still not relaxing sanctions, although there's some kind of negotiation because they blocked Russian oil, so they're allowing Chevron back, and it's going to be possible. It may be possible again for Venezuela to get access to refineries because it has heavy crude and it needs to transition it so that it can make fuel for automobiles. But there have been a lot of developments recently in Venezuela, Dan, and you've been covering some of them from Miami, and you've been to Venezuela. I guess first, before we get into that background behind you, which relates to a different part of the world, but the same issue, what do you make of the Venezuelan opposition basically voting to eliminate Juan Guaido as leader, while the U.S. State Department continues to recognize this character as the president of Venezuela?
Yeah, well, it's very interesting. It will put the State Department in a difficult position. I think, first of all, we have to start with the understanding that Juan Guaido was never the opposition's choice as leader. I mean, he was not a significant figure in the opposition. I think it took a lot of people by surprise in the opposition that he became the U.S. anointed interim president. And so I think this was a long time coming that they were going to get rid of him. And also, I mean, frankly, the only real purpose he serves is to be the depository of billions of dollars of Venezuelan revenue that the U.S. has stolen from Venezuela, right?
Right.
Particularly in the form of Citgo, which happened to be Venezuela's largest single source of revenue. That's Venezuela's U.S. oil company, which probably most of you see around town or did, and maybe even got gas from there. Where that was Venezuela's, it was just stolen from the U.S.
Right.
And I guess ostensibly put into the control of Guaido, though I'm not sure anyone knows how any of that works. But I think there was also a lot of resentment amongst the Venezuelan population, certainly the population, but also the opposition, that Guaido was, again, somehow the trustee of all this revenue and money.
Right.
So now they've gotten rid of him, but they've named, I guess, a 3-person junta in his stead, and we'll see what happens there. We'll see. Is the U.S. going to recognize that junta? Are they going to take control of these monies? Where are those monies? I mean, when all's said and done, I fear that that money's just going to be gone. It's money that Venezuela could have used for food and for medicine, and it's just going to be gone somewhere. But I think that's what this is largely about, is money.
How much has been looted from Venezuela by the U.S.? I know I forget what the Venezuelan government's figure is, but it's an astounding sum.
I mean, it's certainly in the tens of billions of dollars. I mean, Citgo alone was worth tens of billions of dollars.
Right. I mean, it's their largest foreign holding.
Yes. So it's huge. And of course, you have the $1 billion or more of gold that the Bank of England's holding, under
Right.
the same premise that Guaido's the rightful president and not Nicolas Maduro. I mean, at one point, the government of Venezuela claimed that their revenue was cut to almost zero because of this sort of theft and sanctions. So it's been very devastating. And now the U.S., of course, they got court approval to sell Citgo off in pieces.
Right.
And I don't know where the U.S. is with that. But I mean, the fact is that Citgo may never go back into the hands of Venezuela. I mean, it's an incredible thing when you see just this kind of blatant theft. I mean, what gives the U.S. the right to just steal assets? Of course, with Russia, the West stole $300 billion, right? After the special operation started, it stole $7 billion from Afghanistan. I mean, we just steal stuff, right? I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah, this does relate to a recent vote in the House on the theft of assets from so-called Russian oligarchs inside the U.S., but it's basically property from private Russian citizens who were residing in the U.S., and only 8 members of Congress voted against it. You had the kind of MAGA anti-Ukraine proxy war caucus, Bobert Gates, Taylor Greene, and Thomas Massey, who's kind of his own thing, sort of a Rand Paul style libertarian. And then you actually had 4 members of the squad standing up to this. Why? Because of the Constitution. It forbids you from stealing assets without a fair trial or any civil procedure from people in the United States. You can't do it. But now the US government is saying they can do it. Why? Because of Russia, because they're Russian. And this is what the DEA, through the drug war, has been doing to American citizens through civil asset forfeiture, where when someone is accused of being a drug dealer, all their property just gets looted before they're even convicted. So it makes sense that progressives might stand up against that, but only 4 did. Only 8 members of Congress it stood up for the Constitution. There have been earlier waves of thefts of the property of Russians in the U.S., and you mentioned, Dan, the theft of the gold in the Bank of England that belonged to Venezuela. I assume they were storing it there because it didn't seem safe in a country that had experienced U.S.-backed riots over the years. And so they thought it was safe there. And then as soon as Juan Guaido is appointed president with far fewer votes than Kevin McCarthy got, that would be exactly 0 votes. They steal the gold. It's pure piracy.
Yeah.
And
no,
here's
it's shocking. It's
yeah.
shocking. And it has real world consequences, again, because they need the revenue to feed their people, and it just, it takes that away from them. But also, I mean, really, even if you're a capitalist, it undermines the capitalist system. Like, people need to be able to invest money, deposit gold and other commodities safely for the system to work and be trustworthy. And the U.S. has made it clear, you can't trust us. We just might steal it or freeze your accounts. The Canadian government did that to the truckers, and people supported the truckers. We'll just freeze your accounts if we don't like what you're saying. And
right.
And again, as you say, this flouts all domestic and international standards of due process. But but that's been thrown out the window. And as you say, who's left to say this shouldn't be done? And it could happen to either one of us, Max. You know that. So
Well, I'm glad you brought up the truckers or either one of us because it's happened to people we know. I mean, Wyatt Reed, who's been on this show, has had his Venmo and PayPal frozen without any explanation. Mint Press, our friends at Mint Press, same thing. Consortium News, same thing, without any explanation. Um, and Mint Press and Consortium News, they're not Russian state affiliated media. I mean, they're independent outlets. And this is also happening on the right, or the Daily Skeptic, which had criticized COVID restrictions and was criticizing what passed for the science for the past 3 years. They've had their accounts removed by PayPal. It's obvious that something's going on there that we've been witnessing through the Twitter files, where the FBI and the other government agency, OGA, which actually is code for CIA, State Department, through their Global Engagement Center, are actually going to these supposedly private outlets, private social media platforms and cash transfer platforms, and telling them who to kick off, just delivering them ultimatums. And PayPal is going along with it. Actually, one of PayPal's early creators from the PayPal mafia, Peter Thiel, has slammed this process.
yeah, well,
So
again, because how does PayPal continue to operate when people don't feel secure, with their monies in there, or to transfer money through there, or to run a business through there? Um, of course, though, I guess most people are not dissidents and assume that it won't happen to them because they don't say anything worth saying, which is maybe true. But it certainly is the case that people who take a dissident line, which you have a right to do under the First Amendment, risk losing everything. And again, maybe they won't put you in jail, but they'll just make it impossible for you to make a living. Another example, not from the U.S., is Grant Phillips. That was
right,
done to
right,
him. He's a reporter from the UK, and all of his accounts were frozen, I think, by the EU, if I'm not mistaken. But in any case, he's having trouble making a living the way he was because of that. So it's something people should be concerned about. But again, not enough are. I'm certainly concerned. I mean, I'll just give you a little story. It doesn't have
yeah,
anything to do with accounts being frozen yet, but maybe it's a segue into our next topic, though it doesn't have to be. When I got back from Russia, I had a global entry pass, which you pay $100 for and you have to get an interview. When I got to the airport and put my passport in the global entry kiosk like 10 times, it said, "You're not enrolled in global entry." And then the woman in customs said, "Well, go to the line over there, the regular line. They'll tell you what's going on." And it turns out they just unenrolled me without telling me. And then I was pulled in for questioning by customs, which, by the way, is the second time in a row I've returned from an international trip and have been stopped and pulled into the interrogation room and questioned. The point is, the government can make life very, very difficult on people that they disapprove of. And the other thing I was surprised about a little bit is that they knew where I was. I mean, they had known I was in Russia, even though I flew back directly from Finland. So it wouldn't have shown up on that trip that I was in Russia. They even knew I was in Donetsk, even though there was no record of that. They were
right.
maybe following my social media. But I mean, what it means is, obviously I've gotten someone's attention. So, there are costs to doing all this stuff, as you know, Max. So,
Yeah, at the very least, you lose your global entry.
yeah.
Um, no, I always get the X on my entry pass that you pick up at customs, and then
Yes.
I get a few extra questions for the most part. But the only time anything ever happened to me like that was returning. I think it was returning from Venezuela with Anya Parampil, and they took her passport, took us in another room, and
Yeah.
basically X-rayed her bag. And what they were looking for, I was the sword of Bolivar,
Oh
because
my God.
Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, had given the Venezuelan Embassy Protection Collective the symbolic sword of Bolivar, which is like a like a symbolic award that the Venezuelan Bolivarian government gives to people who show solidarity to it. We never had a sword. I wasn't going to run around with a sword.
Right.
And it was
Especially
kind
through
of,
customs, for God's sake.
it
Yeah.
was ridiculous, but they were obsessed with this sword, and everyone got their bags x-rayed who had been remote, kind of connected with the EPC. But yeah, I mean, our PayPal is still active, and basically I'm just going to stay there until something happens. I don't see any reason to remove ourselves. And, a lot of people have gone to locals from Patreon, but, we're just going to stay on Patreon until something happens. Patreon does censor more. There've been campaigns to get us kicked off there, but we're still there. So we're just going to maintain. But Dan, let me ask you about something that's on a very closely related topic, which is your coverage of the trial of Alex Saab.
Mhm.
And you made the point in in a kind of analysis op-ed report for the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. I'll get it on screen in a second. That trial and the defense of Alex Saab proved that he was indeed a diplomat. But let's just step back for a second and examine the insanity of this trial. Alex Saab was named a diplomat by the Venezuelan government. He's a citizen of Colombia and Venezuela. He's a businessman who has no citizenship in the United States. I don't think he has any business in the United States, but he's on trial in a Miami federal court, and he was essentially kidnapped by the United States.
Right.
So first, before we get into the details, how could this possibly happen? And doesn't this kind of seem like the theft, the seizure of assets abroad that do not belong to the United States?
Yeah, it's a total flouting of international law, of the Vienna Convention on diplomatic relations. So first of all, as you say, he had virtually no contact with the U.S. at all. The only connection they could get him on, and they were looking to get him on anything because he was flouting U.S. sanctions. He was getting food and medicine and oil for Venezuela, which the U.S. was trying to starve Venezuela of, and that was his great offense. Now, the only connection he had was that apparently there were 5 transactions through 5 different U.S. banks, um, running from Venezuela through those banks for materials, building materials for homes, for the housing projects for the poor in Venezuela.
Right.
So that's how they try to get him, saying, well, okay, we have jurisdiction because you happen to use our banks for a temporary, transaction. But he had been appointed a diplomat in 2018 at a time, by the way, that the U.S. was recognizing Nicolas Maduro as the president. And he was on a diplomatic mission from Venezuela to Iran when he stopped to refuel in Cabo Verde, which is an island nation off the coast of West Africa. He was seized, arrested, and held there for a year based on a U.S. extradition request. And the U.S. tried to claim, oh well, he wasn't a diplomat. All the evidence they have that he was a diplomat was made up after the fact. And as we witnessed, Anya and I witnessed at the hearing, the defense brought in a lawyer, a young lawyer from Cabo Verde, who met with Saab in his prison cell shortly after his arrest, and he found out that, contrary to the prison corrections policy in Cabo Verde, he was never given the chance to assign his property over to someone to take care of it for him. So it was being
Right.
held by the prison officials. So the lawyer got Saab to sign over his property to him. The lawyer took it, and he found in the suitcase of Saab 3 diplomatic pouches that had been opened, clearly by the Cabo Verde prison officials, and they had letters in there from Venezuelan officials, including the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, to officials in Iran. These were clearly diplomatic pouches. And by the way, there was markings at the top which showed not only were they opened, but they were copied,
Right.
and made into JPEGs and clearly sent to U.S. officials. And how
Right.
do we know that? Because the copies, the young lawyer was asked, were those markings at the top when you saw them in Cabo Verde? No, those weren't there. When did they appear? They appeared later, and the prosecution from the U.S. in the course of discovery gave those copies to the defense. So clearly they had them in their possession because they were sent the copies from the people in Cabo Verde.
Right.
So not only was the U.S., did they take this diplomat improperly, they lied to the court by saying, oh, the defense has made all this up, when they darn well knew that these were bona fide documents that he was carrying.
So these documents were sent by Nicolas Maduro to Ayatollah
The
Ali
Ayatollah, the one
Khamenei,
from Nicolas Maduro, was to the supreme
the
leader of
supreme
Iran.
leader, and then Delcy Rodriguez to the vice president of Iran. So they're writing to their counterparts.
One to the agricultural minister as well from Delcy, to talk about getting food from Iran.
And Alex Saab was the liaison to deliver these messages, and he was also a liaison for financial and business ties between Iran and Venezuela. Now, while we were in Caracas, Sonia Parampil and I visited a new Iranian supermarket that had opened and was bringing, it was kind of like it was bigger than a supermarket. It was like a Walmart. I mean, you could buy Persian rugs there. You could buy all sorts of clothes and housewares and Iranian products. I mean, first rate dates and jam. And I mean, Iran actually makes pretty good toothpaste. I got some tooth whitening charcoal toothpaste from there. But the point of this supermarket was to break the sanctions regime, to break the embargo, and to give people in Caracas first rate products from Iran. And so it was really a symbol of this burgeoning relationship. But more importantly, Iran was traveling 5,000 miles across the planet with these huge tanker ships delivering parts to repair Venezuela's oil extraction sites so that they could power their economy again. Because another point of the U.S. embargo was to prevent Venezuela from being able to repair its oil wells, and thereby denying it revenue, starving it to death until the government just cries uncle and gives up. And so Iran came in and said, no, we're not going to let that happen. And it worked. Yeah. It helped. It made it. And they also provided them with thinning agents for their heavy crude. And this is an amazing example of two countries that are under siege by the U.S., that are small, traditionally colonized countries coming together and breaking the siege. And Alex Saab sat at the middle of this diplomatic fulcrum point, and the U.S. targeted him, I think, as a result, right? And he was tortured in Cape Verde and Cabo Verde by what he portrayed as CIA agents. I mean, they were at least pressuring him heavily to give up sensitive information on how Venezuela broke the sanctions.
Yes, and they were denying him medicine at a time he was just recovering from cancer. He was put into solitary confinement. Yeah, he was greatly mistreated. And as you say, he had a key to his release, and that was simply to tell tales about Venezuela, name names, make up stories, whatever, to try to embarrass Maduro, and he was unwilling to do it. He has been unwilling to do it. He's now been held for 2.5 years. About a year in Cabo Verde, now a year and a half in a prison in Miami. And, he has not, taken the easy way out, which I think says a lot about his character.
Yeah.
And I think, and he did a lot, a lot of the help he got that was given by Iran was negotiated by Saab. He had made 2 prior trips to Iran to negotiate oil, food, medicine, when he then made his 3rd attempt, and that's when he was arrested.
So where does the case stand now? It seems that
the judge ruled against his diplomatic immunity claim. That will be, I believe, immediately appealed by the defense. So the 11th Circuit, which is the Court of Appeals, where he in the circuit he's in, will hear that appeal. But meanwhile, the case on the merits will go on. So he will probably have to stand trial on these very vague money laundering charges against him, and he has other defenses as well. There was not and is not an extradition treaty between the U.S. and Cabo Verde when he was extradited. That will be a big claim. There was not an Interpol notice out for his arrest at the time he was arrested in Cabo Verde.
Right.
There were
Right.
so many irregularities that will be raised, and of course, they'll also claim on the merits that he didn't do anything wrong. In fact, it has to be pointed out that there was a Swiss banking expert who examined the transactions in question and found that there was nothing wrong with them. So this is all trumped up against a guy who, really, yeah, certainly he's a businessman. He was making money on what he did, but was also risking a lot to help the Venezuelan people, and that's why the Venezuelan government is standing behind him.
Well, we're here with journalist and author Dan Kovalik, and we've been streaming live talking about a variety of subjects, but from Venezuela to Nicaragua to Cuba to social media and financial censorship to the financial sanctioning of individual citizens right here in the shining city on the hill. But Dan, are you sitting in front of some kind of Soviet monument?
Yeah, well, what it is, it's a World War II monument. Let me get out of the way here. In the People's Republic of Donetsk. And you can see it was shelled. And it was intentionally shelled by Ukrainian forces in a big battle in 2014. And it was left that way to show, that the government in Kiev and the forces out of Kiev are trying to destroy any remnants of the Soviet defeat of the Nazis, and that's what this monument was built for.
Right. Monuments to Nazi collaborators are going up in Western Ukraine. Monuments to Soviet partisans who fought the Nazis are going down.
Exactly. And so I went to this particular memorial. I was actually brought there by an older man. I mean, he was I would say elderly man. Well, he was only, I guess, in his early 60s, though he looked a lot older, I think, because of what he had been through. But on this site, not only is it a memorial, but it became a battleground. So on this site, this older man in 2014 was with, I believe, 7 other comrades who were defending Donetsk from the Ukrainian forces. And he chanced upon at this scene, which is really a fairly isolated place on a hill, he chanced upon tanks and soldiers who were lining up to invade Donetsk en masse. By the way, there were Polish soldiers as well. This is in 2014. And he described all this to us. And because he was so outnumbered with his comrades, he actually called in his own people and said, shell my location, shell this memorial, because we're about to be invaded. And he did that 3 times. And by doing that, he probably saved Donetsk from a full-scale invasion. But meanwhile, his other comrades were killed, and there's graves to them there. But it was a pretty amazing story. But that is what happened at this site. And meanwhile, this World War II memorial has now been expanded, and is now also a memorial to people who have died fighting the Ukrainian forces since 2014. Interestingly, the guy who told us this story and who was involved in this battle would sometimes call the people who were invading Germans, which gives you a lot, it gives you a good impression of what they think they're fighting, and that is fascism. In fact, Donetsk was once called, up till 1961, up until the de-Stalinization by Khrushchev, it was called Stalino. I don't know if you know that.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So one of the rallying cries of people in Donetsk is first Stalingrad, now Stalino, right? Stalingrad was where, after these big battles, the Nazis were turned back in retreat. in 1942 towards, or 43, towards Germany, and they said, well, that's what's going to happen here. We're going to turn the fascists back again from Stalino, now Donetsk. So that's very interesting. And I told you, Max, before this interview, something that you didn't know and I didn't know before I went to Donetsk, and that was that Donetsk is the site of the second largest mass grave of the Nazis during World War II. 75,000 people were thrown into a mass grave, basically down the piping of a factory, some alive. These were victims of the Nazis, and there's a memorial to that and to those people in Donetsk. And again, one has to understand the psyche of people who went through that, and who,
Yeah.
for them, that history's not a long time ago. They had grandparents who went through that, right? Everyone had some family member that went through that. And they feel that what they're fighting for now is as drastic as what they were then. So,
Well, yeah, we all had family that went through the war that we knew of,
yeah,
my
my uncles
generation and
all
yours.
fought in World War II. Yeah, absolutely. But the difference is, or at least I can only say for me, all my family by that time was in the United States. I'm Slovak, but my
Right.
grandfather emigrated after World War One. But it's one thing to go overseas and fight an enemy. It's quite another to have to fight that enemy on your own territory, where the enemy occupies you, puts your people in concentration camps, rapes women, steals your food, destroys your housing. That, the U.S. doesn't know from that,
Yeah.
right? And that, I think, people have to understand when they think about this conflict, that the Russians did go through that,
Well,
and it's very fresh in their minds.
yeah, I mean, the past isn't even past, as Faulkner said. Let me throw something up on screen that should illustrate that really strongly. I mean, this is what's happening in Kiev right now, and you have the Ukrainian Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, officially honoring Stepan Bandera, who is responsible for a lot of these crimes. And here's Ukrainian clergy from the schismatic Ukrainian Orthodox Church honoring Stepan Bandera. There he is with a new memorial.
Isn't that
And
amazing?
this is what we're paying for. This is your tax dollars at work. This is a mass murdering psychopath who was also a OSS asset after the war. I don't know how, any American who has family who fought in this war. My grandfather's flew scores of missions, who had family that suffered in the war, perhaps in the Jewish genocide or anything else, could look at that and not just be disgusted by what we're paying for.
Yeah, well, that's the incredible part, isn't it, Max? I mean, not only, when all of this started, well, obviously it started in 2014, which we have to constantly repeat, because that history's been totally obscured.
Yeah.
But when the Russia intervened as it did in February, at first, outlets that had talked about Nazis in Ukraine were then saying, well, there's no Nazis in Ukraine. And then soon, because it was impossible to ignore, because they had to do backflips to try to avoid in photographs swastikas and other things, right? When they were photographing Ukrainian troops. So then
Yeah.
they had to admit, okay, I guess there's some Nazis, right? And then later they were like, okay, I guess there's a lot of Nazis, but they're good Nazis. And basically that's where we're at. Where
Yeah.
the mainstream media is basically like, hey, these are Nazis of a different kind. You can get behind these guys. And as you said, imagine people who lost family in the Holocaust, who lost family fighting the Nazis. How sickening this should be, at least. But somehow the propaganda has worked. And you have, again, many liberals who just now are like, yay, and they don't even know what they're rooting for or what they're really rooting against here, and it's quite shocking. I didn't think I would ever see the day where again Nazis were basically being applauded publicly. I mean, we know that after World War II, the U.S. partnered with Nazis in the Cold War, right? The U.S. brought 1,100 Nazi scientists over to help with our rocket program in what
Right.
was known as Operation Paperclip. The U.S. worked with Nazis in Greece to overthrow the government there, worked with neo-Nazis and fascists in Latin America. But none of that was out in the open. It was being done, but that was not discussed in polite company. That's what the U.S. was doing. Those were secret covert projects. But now it's all out in the open, where
Yeah.
people are basically saying "Hooray for Nazis," and it's just, I mean, shocking. It's just shocking. And the way they've done it, in part, and again, as the photo behind me shows, is they have falsified history.
Yep.
They have now tried to say basically that the Soviet Union, we've always been against them and the Russians, and that they're the fascists and they're the historic fascists, right? And so everything's flipped on its upside down. Now, that's not the first time. I mean, that's been a process that's been happening for a while. You might remember when you're a little young, Max, but I remember when Ronald Reagan, he was with Chancellor Helmut Kohl, and they went
Yeah.
to
Bitburg.
went to a military grave site, which I think there were Nazis in the grave site.
Yes.
And Reagan said something to the effect that he turned to Kohl and said, "We've always been on the same side." Like, really? No, I don't think so. But that's what we've been seeing for many decades, where the Soviet sacrifice to defeat the Nazis has been forgotten, and really the whole nature of World War II has been falsified. It's really an incredible thing.
Well, the Azov Battalion, which is the ideologically neo-Nazi wing of the Ukrainian military, which are now hailed as defenders for their final stand in Mariupol against the Russian army, has an ideological vision, that extends beyond Ukraine. They have a national core, which is their ideological wing. It's where they put Andrei Beletsky, their founder, who said that the mission of Azov was to defeat the Semite-led Untermenschen in a war led by the white race. And that really speaks to their vision, but geopolitically, their vision is called the Intermarium. It builds on a concept spun out by the post-World War I era Polish general Joseph Pilsudski, which aims to unite countries like Ukraine, Hungary, and Poland in a kind of fascistic axis that will preserve their own independence against both the Soviet Union and Germany, which are the two powerful forces in the neighborhood. And now you see what NATO is doing there and the kind of forces that it's recruiting as its shock troops or foot soldiers. And it dovetails very closely with that vision of the Intermarium. Now, the Azov Battalion is also simultaneously attempting to rebrand, and it's sending figures from the Mariupol siege of the Azovstal plant to the United States. And they've recently been on a tour all across the United States where they're welcomed. And here we have a piece at the Grayzone we republished by researcher Moss Robeson. And this shows former U.S. ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. We call him McPhail or McFool at the Grayzone because his commentary on Twitter is just so embarrassing and such an indictment of the intellectual capacity of America's foreign policy elite. But here he is meeting at Stanford University with the Azov Battalion as I mean, this is the wolf.
With a modified swastika up there.
Modified swastika right behind Michael McFaul at Stanford.
Isn't it incredible?
I mean,
and people are applauding this. And this is at Stanford, right?
Yeah.
One of the great liberal California universities.
Yeah. Well, it's where they, it's definitely a CIA bastion. McFaul is there at the Hoover Institute which is headed by Condoleezza Rice, who's another person who got kicked upstairs after the smoking gun failed to turn into a mushroom cloud. They're funded by the energy industry, the arms industry, all of the industries that are benefiting from this proxy war. And here he is, he stops in just to salute literal neo-Nazis. I mean, these aren't, and when I say neo-Nazis, I'm not just being glib. Like, it's been demonstrated by Moss Robertson and others that these Azov veterans on tour have tweeted praise of Adolf Hitler and Nazism in general on their Twitter accounts. It's not something they conceal. Here you have, an Azov member in Chicago. Then we have, these are the patches that Azov has been selling on tour. As you said, a rebranded swastika, and behind this wolf's angle, which is inspired by the Nazi SS and specifically the SS Galicia battalion of Ukrainians that fought alongside the SS Einsatzgruppen and murdered Jews, Poles, and ethnic Russians. You see the Sonnenrad, which is another symbol you constantly see on the uniforms of Ukrainian soldiers, and that is an SS pagan-inspired symbol. And I mean, we could just go on and on with photos from their tour. Here's one person that's been on tour, and she is an ideological neo-Nazi who has said that feminism is ready to mutilate and sell women. Well, we could go on and on about it, but it's the desecration of history is truly shocking to watch. But Dan, how did it feel seeing the U.S. coverage of this war and then being in Donbass? I mean, tell us what you witnessed there and how it felt.
Well, it was very interesting to be there. I mean, first of all, the Donbass is a lost place in the sense that these are Ukrainian people who get no voice in the United States. People say stand with Ukraine. And when they say stand with Ukraine, what they really mean is stand with the government in Kiev. They don't care about these people in the Donbass who've been attacked by the government in Kiev.
And the Galician tradition they represent, which only represents a plurality of Ukrainians.
Right. So these people in the Donbass, and it is a lot of people in Ukraine, they're mostly Russian speakers. But Ukraine was part of Russia for centuries, by the way. We have to start with that understanding. And also, the Donbass in particular was even a part of Russia, the Federation of Russia, even during some of the Soviet period. It was actually the main industrial heartland of Russia, So, and the government in Kiev really resents and is against these people because they see them as Russians, not Ukrainians, right? And the people there have been under attack for 9 years now from the government in Kiev. Not just shelled, but the Azov battalion and others have occupied parts of Donetsk. They took over, for example, the Mariupol airport and used it as their base. They arrested and tortured people there. I met people who experienced that, including an individual who, his name's Igor. He's actually from Odessa, which is not in the Donbass, just so people know. But he went to Donetsk to defend Donetsk when it was attacked by the government in Kiev. He was held by the Azov battalion for 4 years and tortured. And he can't even tell his story without crying. And I met a lot of people like that, and the other thing, a lot of children died during that conflict. As far back as 2014, there's a memorial to the children who died called Angel's Alley, which has all these stuffed animals there that people have put. In total, as we know the figure, Max, and this is according to the UN High Commission for Human Rights, 14,000 people were killed in that conflict, even before February of 2022, right? But those people have been forgotten. And that's what's really sad. It's like what they've been going through and their struggle is not getting any publicity. There are no, as far as I know, mainstream Western media in the Donbass.
Yeah.
The only Western media, if you want to call them media, or Western journalists, there are independent people like me, Eva Bartlett. That's another story. Eva Bartlett, Graham Phillips, and a few others,
Well,
right?
Alina Lip, who we've interviewed here at the Grayzone, she's had her bank account seized. Her parents are being financially penalized by the German government, and the German government has announced plans to prosecute her if she ever returns,
Right.
simply for reporting.
No, exactly. If you go to Donetsk, you are considered basically a terrorist, because if you give their point of view is that we've been attacked by the government of Kiev that the NATO's been supporting. And frankly, and this is the truth, what they would say is, we were glad the Russians came in. In fact, we wish they had come in 2014 to defend us. If they're mad at all at Russia, it's that they waited 8 years to come in. And Russia's now engaged in reconstruction efforts there. I saw housing that was being built by the Russians and a hospital. And they are rebuilding every day as things get shelled. While I was there, a school was shelled by the Ukrainian forces using NATO weaponry. A building was also shelled by the Ukrainians, where people go to get water, because Ukraine has cut Donetsk off from the water system some time ago. And the soccer stadium was also shelled. And by the way, that was very little shelling that I experienced while I was there, those 3 shelling events, because after I left, there's been now hundreds of shelling since then. It really went up, and it continues to happen. And now I have friends there. I met very lovely, lovely people there who, by the way, the Ukrainians may hate them, but they don't hate them in return. That's not their thing. They just want to be left alone, really.
That's interesting. That was an observation I made when I was in the Gaza Strip. So I just didn't sense this kind of all-encompassing hatred the same way I did in much of Israel for Palestinians.
No, and the interesting thing that people told me, and this may be interesting to some people, it certainly was to me as a student of the Soviet Union, that a lot of the people that I talked to in Donetsk don't consider themselves Russian, don't consider themselves Ukrainian. They consider themselves Soviet peoples.
Right.
And what they mean by that was, they harken back to a time when everyone in all these different republics, including Ukraine, were part of one family and one nation, though with separate autonomous republics, semi-autonomous, not entirely autonomous. And what they say is that, look, once the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, a sector of Ukrainians, again, mostly in the West, were egged on by the United States to destroy that Soviet mentality and to create an us versus them mentality, where it's us, the true Ukrainians, right, who have more Polish ancestry, against you, the other Ukrainians who we consider really Russians. And that was not a thing during Soviet times. And now it is a thing. And the people suffering are the people in the Donbass. They are the other. And they are the ones that have been persecuted. And again, it looks a lot like Hitler's view of those people, the Slavic people, who were also seen as Untermenschen.
Yeah.
Right. And the U.S. State Department echoes that. Right. They've made crazy statements about Russia, that it's just a gas station posing as a nation, that it doesn't have a culture. It doesn't have a culture. Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Tchaikovsky, Nabokov, it doesn't have a culture. I don't know what to say, but.
Well, it's also the attempt to eradicate any presence of the culture in the West. The Guardian ran an op-ed by a Ukrainian minister, the Minister of Culture, calling to boycott or ban Tchaikovsky.
Right. Yeah, and of course they're banning Russian athletes and Russian ballet dancers and Russian musicians who don't take an oath that they want them to take or to denounce Putin. And let's remind ourselves, no one did that to Americans, right? To American athletes or musicians during the invasion of Iraq. They didn't say, oh, you have to denounce George W. Bush if you're going to run this race or you're going to play this piano concerto. No one did that. And no one would think to do that. But now we've decided, again, and we have to be clear, this is, and a lot of people, I think, are buying into this. This is not just anti-Putin or anti-Russian government. This is anti-Russian. This is racist.
Yeah, I mean, Nazism isn't just about anti-Semitism or the desire to commit genocide against Jews. It's a much more holistic ideology that
Right.
denies it calls for the elimination of other people, Slavic people,
Right.
Roma people, gay people,
Communists. Yeah.
communists, even Polish people. Yes, definitely communist dissidents. And that's something you see expressed so commonly within the post-Maidan Kiev regime. And, what they're doing to the Orthodox Church, like the actual Orthodox Church, which is based in Moscow, is of a part with that. Arresting clergy left and right, raiding churches, declaring them traitors, a treasonous organization, because the State Department has been encouraging Ukraine to create this schismatic Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which
really didn't even exist till 2018.
Right.
And by the way, when I was there, so one of the things I did, just so it's clear, I did not go with any government body to Donetsk. I went with a private group. I went with two guys, and what we brought humanitarian aid with us in the back. And what it was clothes for monks that are living in an Orthodox monastery that's being shelled almost every day by Ukraine. The monks now live underground because their monastery has been largely destroyed. And this is a more extreme example of what the government in Kiev's doing. And I wasn't even allowed to go to the monastery. I said, hey, let's go. I'll help you bring the clothes there. And they said, no, you stay here in Donetsk City because it is not safe to go there. There's a likelihood you'll be shelled. Many of the monks have been killed. And this is not making the nightly news. They're killing monks. And by the way, a lot of them are women. They have separate dorms for women and male monks there. And they're being attacked by the forces of Ukraine with NATO armaments. And that's your tax dollars at work for you.
Yeah, that's your HIMARS. That Tucker Carlson is one of the few cable news hosts talking about this, and he exaggerates it. And the Chiron below him will say Zelensky is at war with Christianity, and then I'll see these sort of left liberal dweebs on Twitter clip that out, the image out, and say, "Oh, sounds legit," like Tucker's just making up something or painting Zelensky because he is of Jewish heritage as some kind of hater of Christianity as a whole. But if you actually listen to the segment, everything he's saying is true. Zelensky is taking down the Orthodox Church.
Yes.
Because they consider it a treasonous, and the clergy is suffering massively. And of course, the American church is saying next to nothing. We've got Aaron Mate in the green room right now. But Dan Kovalik, with Aaron's permission, and Aaron, you can put your thumb up if you agree. I want to do one more quick segment. He's doing a thumbs up. Good. And Aaron, you're welcome to join a quick segment on what's happening in Mexico right now ahead of Biden's visit, because this is pretty wild. Aaron, you want to jump in with us? No, he's thumbs down. Okay. All right. Well, yeah, let me just show you all some video of what happened yesterday in the city of Culiacan in Mexico. It's a straight up war. Less than a week before.
It's incredible. They've told everyone to stay inside. I mean, it's a war zone at this point.
Less than a week before Joe Biden's arrival. And here's what it looks like. Let me put on the sound. These are Mexican gunships attempting to opening fire on members of the Sinaloa cartel, and I'll explain what's happening there. I mean, the fighting lasted all day and all night in civilian neighborhoods. Scores of people were injured. These are gunships provided by the U.S., by the Pentagon. Okay, a military jet landed in Culiacan in their international airport, and it's being fired. This military jet is being fired upon by members of the Sinaloa cartel. Here's even this is wild footage. I gotta get this on screen. This is a member of the Sinaloa cartel. This is an anti-aircraft weapon, and they're trying to down U.S. supplied helicopter gunships. This is heavy. No, I mean it's light weaponry, but they're seriously armed.
Wow.
And you know, we could show more, but basically what's happening is that ahead of Biden's visit, the Mexican Marines, under orders from President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, AMLO, arrested Ovidio Guzman, known as El Raton or the Mouse, who is the son, I think he's 32 years old, of the most well-known narco leader in the world, Chapo Guzman. Ovidio Guzman is said to have been engaged in drug trafficking since he was a teenager. The US DEA has put out a $5 million award for him. They've been pushing the Mexican authorities to do this. And in 2019, Guzman was arrested and then broken out of jail in Culiacan by the Sinaloa cartel, and he's been free ever since. So this was like a top priority ahead of Biden's visit, and it's caused a full-scale war on the streets of Culiacan. Dan, any thoughts on what's happening there?
Well, you know, at least it seems to me, and I like AMLO a lot, and I think he's done a lot of great stuff, but this seems to be a misstep. I think he did this to try to impress Biden, you know, before he came to Mexico, and now he's unleashed some terrible violence. You know, Mexico's really been caught in the middle of this war on drugs, so-called, that the U.S. wanted, right?
Right.
And it's only increased violence in Mexico without really diminishing any drug trafficking into the United States. And in fact, we know, by the way, you remember the Fast and Furious scandal, the Fast and Furious.
Yeah, I was going to go to that next.
Yeah, has nothing to do with your ninth installment of that movie. It is some guns that were sent to Mexico for drug interdiction ended up in the hands of one of the cartels.
Right.
Which happens all the time, by the way. This was I would say a huge scandal, but a momentary one. It kind of was on the screen and then left. But it's just been a disaster for Mexico, and I think AMLO fell into the trap of trying to do something in terms of the war on drugs, again, to impress his, you know, overlords from the north, and it really backfired.
Yeah, well, they did at least capture El Raton, and they've transferred him to Mexico's highest security military base. But Dan, I mean, that's why you're the man, because you know this stuff as well as anyone out there. Fast and Furious. This is Forbes, it's mainstream media. Was Operation Fast and Furious really part of a secret deal between the DEA and Mexico's Sinaloa drug cartel? Okay, Fast and Furious was said by the Obama administration to be an effort to tag guns and allow the hormigas, you know, the ants who are the straw buyers who go to the drug to go to the gun shows in the US, to bring those back across the border. The US would allow them to buy them. The DEA allowed them to buy them on the grounds that they would track the guns and then be able to track and surveil the cartels. But Mexico's El Universal newspaper interviewed DEA agents and jailed Sinaloa cartel members and found that, if I can get through all of these pop-up ads and that, for example, a highly placed member of the Sinaloa cartel said that the deal involved the cartel providing information about rival Mexican drug gangs to the DEA in exchange for the US government agreeing not to interfere with Sinaloa shipments into the United States of drugs, of cocaine, and the dismissal of criminal charges against cartel participants. I mean, this is amazing. It is alleged that U.S. efforts were part of a strategy previously employed by the U.S. government in combating Colombian drug cartels, whereby the government would divide and conquer by making sweetheart deals with one cartel in order to gain information to be used in destroying the cooperating cartel's rivals. So basically, the Sinaloa cartel was allowed to become this powerful paramilitary style force and take over Culiacan, gather up all these weapons that you see on display now in the street as part of this bungled Obama administration strategy to take out other gangs like the Zetas or the Tijuana cartel. And it reminds me a lot of arming the moderate rebels in Syria or something. But we armed the Sinaloa cartel and allowed them to profit and pump drugs into our communities as part of this bizarre strategy. And I remember at the time, Dan, it was like, oh, Darrell Issa and the Republicans are making up all these conspiracy theories. It's like, no, it was actually real.
Well, you know, this happened in Colombia too. Actually, it's even portrayed in the Netflix series Narcos, which is a great show. I don't know if you've seen it, but what it shows, and it's true, this happened. The DEA worked with the Cali cartel to destroy Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel.
Right.
And the Cali cartel was run by the Castaño brothers, who then go on to create the AUC paramilitary death squads. Those are the people we worked with, right? And so what you see time and time, of course, we can get into the Contras as well. The CIA helped fund the Contras by selling cocaine in the streets of the United States. There was, of course, during the Vietnam War as well, heroin was sold to fund CIA operations in Indochina. What we see time and time again is that the U.S., including the DEA, they're not so much against drugs being trafficked. They just want to make sure the people we like are the ones trafficking them. That's what it comes down to. And that is the sickening part of all this. This has done nothing to stop the drug flow in America. It just enriches the people that the U.S. politically supports. That's what this is about.
And it may even increase the drug flow if certain forces can actually get a cut of the profits, as we saw during the 1980s.
Yeah, well, and of course, the biggest example of this is the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. At the time the U.S. invaded, the Taliban had gotten poppy production almost nothing.
Yeah.
And then within a short time after the U.S. invasion, with the U.S. troops all over the place, DEA agents all over the place, CIA agents all over the place, somehow Afghanistan goes back to supplying the world with 85% of its heroin. How'd that happen? You know,
it's all a mystery.
Incredible. Yeah, total mystery, Max.
Total mystery. And just a final point, which is that all the spectacle of all this violence in northern Mexico, not so far from the U.S.-Mexico border, is prompting kind of right-wing elements who want to militarize the border to call for an intervention, a military intervention in Mexico. And then you have the more centrist elements in Washington using this to attack AMLO and saying this, shows that the country is unstable under his watch. But Dan Kowalik, thank you so much for joining us and for all your insights and all the work that you're doing both on the ground and, all the analysis that you do day in and day out. Once again, let's plug your forthcoming book on Nicaragua.
Yeah, Nicaragua, A History of U.S. Intervention and Resistance. Pick it up where books are sold. And Max, I just want to thank you. I admire everything you do. I admire the Grayzone, and please support the Grayzone. Support it at their Patreon account. Thank you very much, Max.
Support it right at the banner right above us. Well, thanks a lot, Dan.
Okay, we'll see you.
Talk to you soon. All right. Well, you're still we got about an hour more. This is the Grayzone. I'm your host, Max Blumenthal. I'm about to be joined by Aaron Mate. And as Dan said, you can support us at patreon.com/Grayzone. You can donate directly through the evil PayPal site. And with no further ado, here's Aaron Mate. Aaron, how are you doing?
Hey, Max, good to see you. And Dan Kovalik, on top of all the analysis and insight he brings us on politics, he also should just teach a course on how to be a prolific author, because he's written so many books in such a short amount of time, while still maintaining a very busy schedule of teaching law, among his other duties, and also traveling the world on behalf of all these noble causes. Last time I saw Dan was in Syria. So he needs to teach a class on how to be productive, because he's a shining example.
Yeah. And, the publishing industry is increasingly closed off to people who think like us. Dan has found a platform at Skyhorse Books, which publishes a range of titles. Aaron, you have a book coming out at OR Books. Is that right?
OR, yeah, I do.
Or you're finishing up a book.
I'm finishing up the book. It's about how Russiagate led to the Ukraine war. And yeah, that should be out later this year. Skyhorse, by the way, also published Stephen F. Cohen's last book.
Yeah.
War with Russia. So yeah, they do a lot of good stuff.
Foreshadowed everything that we're living through right now. We are at war with Russia. I mean, the United States is at war with Russia, using, in the words of Iran-Contra felon Ali North, American bullets and Ukrainian blood. Aaron, so you've been guest hosting Jimmy Dore's show.
Yep.
We've got a lot of people in the chat wondering if you took advantage of his stash.
A little bit. Yeah, I did a little bit. Yeah.
Really?
Okay. Yeah.
There was a debate, and the majority said no, you would not have.
No, I dabbled a little bit. One of the nights I was here, but yeah, not before the show. Obviously, that's not how I roll. But yeah, no, it's great. Yeah,
I can't handle it. Like when I was growing up, the stuff that was available, it's like you'd have some giggles with your friends and watch some TV and get the munchies. Today, it's like you smoke it and you have a life crisis. Like I'll be thinking about my childhood and why did I do that?
Yeah, so, I can't keep up on what the different strains are now. There's supposed to be one strain that's very mellow and another strain that's also mellow, but a different kind of mellow. I don't know. Maybe somebody in the chat could enlighten us. I
see the bags that get sold out of dispensaries in DC, and it'll be like crack, hardcore crack. I'm just why would you want to smoke something called crack? But anyway, that's just me. No, shout out to all the smokers in the chat. If you we don't judge. Yeah. We welcome everybody.
Light one up for the Grayzone.
Light it up for the smoke a blunt. It's 4:20. It's almost 4:20 actually. It's 4:17 Eastern time. Yeah. So yeah, in 3 minutes you know what to do. Someone's saying crack is good. I don't know. Never tried it. Anyway, Aaron, have you been following what's been happening here in Washington? It's been portrayed as chaos and some of the worst qualities of the Republican extremism on display, with Kevin McCarthy, the California Republican, who is endorsed by Donald Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene, but is generally attacked by the sort of MAGA wing Freedom Caucus of the Republican Party, failing to gain the speakership after 11 votes, but it now appears that there has been a deal. What are your thoughts?
Well, maybe I'm missing something, but I love it because even if, of course, I agree with the substance of a lot of what these Republicans are asking for, although not all of it, I have to say, which we can talk about, but still the act of using their political leverage to extract concessions, that's exactly what, of course, was demanded of progressives back during First the Vote, with Jimmy Dore leading the way. And progressives refuse to use their leverage for anything. And by the way, there's been a lot of confusion about that by people who want to diss Force the Vote. Yes, Jimmy Dore's ask and many other people's ask was for a floor vote for Medicare for all. But that wasn't the only request. Many people put forward requests for different kinds of things that could advance a somewhat progressive agenda. And Jimmy Dore was among those saying, just use your leverage for something. If it's not like for Medicare for all, use it for something, get something, $15 minimum wage, whatever it is. And they refused. And now I think those progressives are being humiliated by these far-right Republicans who are using their leverage to extract concessions, and to such a degree that they're refusing to cave even when McCarthy has given them some stuff. When McCarthy has given them, that they're still holding out, but that appears to have succeeded. And, as we're recording this, things could change. But as of right now, there's supposed to be another vote tonight. And the talk is that finally McCarthy's won enough people by giving up enough concessions, because these hard right Republicans kept holding out. And among the concessions are things, of course, I loathe, like apparently they want to cut food stamps or something like that. So, of course, if that's true, then I bitterly oppose that. But apparently also they've won, or they're seeking a cut in military spending, a $75 billion cut in military spending, which, if that goes through, would be one of the most substantial cuts in Pentagon spending ever, as I understand it. And they're also seeking things like more transparency for votes. So not dumping votes at the last second, and not like filling bills with, just dozens and dozens of pages of text that no one's ever going to read. So make it a more transparent process. And so how could I oppose that?
Yeah. I mean, here's a tweet from Bloomberg about the $75 billion cut in defense spending, which is remarkable, but I'm not necessarily as interested in what this coalition of Republicans is demanding of Kevin McCarthy. It's the fact that they're holding back their votes to get what they want, and actually representing their constituents and being actual populists and using the levers of democracy to the extent that they still exist. It's the fact that they're doing that and they're winning. They're getting what they want. That interests me first and foremost. And we will get into the details of what all of this means for policy, for spending, for Ukraine aid. But that's what's significant. Why? Because it never happened. It never happened on the Democratic side when the warmongering Wall Street tool, Nancy Pelosi, was running for the speakership. Now let's just watch what Matt Gaetz, who's leading the charge against McCarthy, had to say.
Humble to a fault. Maybe the right person for the job of Speaker of the House isn't someone who wants it so bad. Maybe the right person for the job of Speaker of the House isn't someone who has sold shares of themselves for more than a decade to get it. Maybe Jim Jordan is the right person for Speaker of the House because he is not beholden to the lobbyists and special interests who have corrupted this place and corrupted this nation under the leadership of both Republicans and Democrats. Maybe Jim Jordan would be the right person for Speaker of the House because he wouldn't fight us when we try to get a term limits bill on the floor. Maybe Jim Jordan would be the right person because he wouldn't fight us when we try to put a balanced budget on the floor and vote for it. And maybe Jim Jordan is the right person because he would endorse the plan that was built by the Texas delegation to finally secure our border. Mr. Jordan said in his nomination that there are certain bills that...
Well, you get the point. And Jim Jordan is not going to accept any nomination. I mean, he's not in the running, but that was significant. He's essentially calling both parties corrupt and calling out the power of lobbyists. I think that was Steve Cohen glowering behind Matt Gaetz from the Democratic side. But we never saw this from the squad. We never saw it. And they seem to have more popular support, at least from their own constituents, for a maneuver like that, especially if it came to defense spending. Or what did AOC, how did she launch her campaign against Crowley? Abolishing ICE. So, reducing spending on the security state. They had a constituency for that and they abandoned it. Why?
Yeah. And, they would maybe say what Matt Gaetz said about both parties being corrupt to their own supporters, like, in rallies or in their own social media videos. But I can't imagine them saying that on the House floor. So for him to get up on the House floor and say that both parties are corrupt or controlled by lobbyists, I hate to say it, but I just don't see that kind of clarity coming from the progressive side, at least when they are in Congress. Now, sometimes when they need votes and have to appeal to progressives, they'll say stuff like that. But it just, as someone who identifies as progressive, it's pretty frustrating to see these far right Republicans being the ones willing to, hold out for a cut to military spending. That blows my mind. $75 billion, if that goes through, and this isn't just circus, which it could be. I mean, some of this could just be performance and they don't actually intend on achieving these kinds of asks. But if that's true, that's a huge indictment of progressives, that such a huge ask like that, and such a major act of progress, which is cutting the military budget, and to the tune of $75 billion would come from the far right.
Yeah. And, here's a point that I made. I mean, Matt Gaetz, he's never going to be well liked in Washington. He's just generally seen as a figure of contempt. Says the media sees him as kind of a joke. Lauren Boebert, all of these figures are hated in Washington. But, when you come in as AOC, you have the chance to be a celebrity. I mean, they say politics is show business for ugly people. But if you're like relatively kind of not an ugly person, the sky's the limit. And here's what happened with I mean, this was the result. You get the cover of Rolling Stone with Nancy Pelosi if you support a Wall Street warmonger after running as a socialist along with Ilhan Omar. I mean, that's amazing. Ilhan Omar was even more strongly anti-war in her presentation when she came in. But, if you do that, you can't be a celebrity influencer. And you're not going to be wealthy when you leave politics. Or in AOC's case, it seems like she wants to be senator or governor or even run for president in 2028. The first millennial Instagram live candidate. And the Republicans just don't have that.
On top of the fact that Nancy Pelosi stands for everything that progressives oppose, there's also the fact that Nancy Pelosi has tried to, undermine progressive candidates like AOC and Ilhan Omar, but yet there they are posing with her for the cover of a magazine. And I wonder what the most good faith interpretation of that decision is. Like, they think that doing that they'll ingratiate themselves with Nancy Pelosi, and that will open up some space for them to get through some genuinely progressive measures. I mean, I imagine that's what the thinking is, but if that's the case, I just haven't seen any proof of that. I haven't seen any kind of leeway given to progressives in there. I haven't seen what the result has been, but I'd love to hear someone make the case. Like, what has been the tangible result of playing nice with Nancy Pelosi from a progressive point of view? I'd love to hear someone make that case. I'm not capable of making it, but someone must have it, and I'd love to hear what that is.
I think that was the tangible result.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, that's probably what it is. Yeah.
I mean, I know how I don't cover Congress. I don't cover the Hill. I live near the Hill, like not far from the Hill. So I go up there and hear what people are saying. And I know how the media works. And if you want to be liked in this town, Pelosi, I mean, people outside of this town hate her, but she is pretty well liked by the media here and respected. And she has this very strong, a very powerful network. And so to be part of that at the beginning of your career is to pretty much guarantee longevity in Washington. And AOC came in as an outsider, and she wasn't liked initially by a lot of her colleagues. I mean, they considered her sort of dangerous and ridiculous and a threat. I mean, she was campaigning as a socialist, and now that's sort of changed. And, you see it when I used to be allowed in the Capitol. I would see it when she would come into a committee hearing. She was sort of like the star of the party, and the media would surround her, and she was taken very seriously. Pelosi could, can shiv you too. I mean, she could really screw you over. So that's what it's about. And the Republicans, I mean, it's being portrayed. I mean, I was watching Anderson Cooper last night, just passing by a TV, because that's the only way I'm ever going to watch Anderson Cooper. It's like if you're in an airport, or it's like,
oh yeah.
And
captive audience.
Captive. Exactly. CNN is like the captive audience news network. And his correspondent was saying, our enemies are watching us and wondering what kind of unity this country has and what kind of stability we have after the speaker has failed to get nominated after 11 votes. And he's basically saying that we need to be less democratic and have less democracy because of Russia and China. that we need to be less democratic for Putin and Xi. That's a democratic and centrist or establishment talking point about what's happening here. But what I see, as you said in your initial reaction, Aaron, is a rare glimmer of democratic deliberation.
Yeah. And look, on that point about our enemies, our so-called enemies, like without fail, anytime there's anything that is perceived to threaten the establishment in some way, the argument is always that this will help Russia. So I don't know if you saw this recently, but there was that British politician who was talking about striking nurses who wanted better wages and better conditions. And he said that we have to send a message to Vladimir Putin right now. And this is undermining that. So nurses seeking better pay is helping Vladimir Putin, according to this politician.
I forget his name. That same whack job said that about the potential rail strike that Putin was encouraging that. I brought it up actually at our when we were at Collision in Toronto on stage, and I learned that British parliamentarian is actually a member of the 77th Brigade, which is the propaganda division of the British Army. I'm also looking for a Michael McFaul tweet. I'm not finding it right now, where he basically said that debating Ukraine aid is something that cannot happen in Washington. It's an unacceptable display of division, and we need to have total unity on it. Essentially, those debates are not allowed. And there have been debates actually within the context of Kevin McCarthy's nomination on these issues. Let me show some footage of that. And the response by the Democrat to Matt Gaetz, the Democrat Steve Cohen of Tennessee, is really interesting here.
President Trump, I believe, is the first president in my lifetime that didn't start any new wars. This is an issue that I know unites some elements of the right and left for the benefit of our communities.
Will the House be in order?
He got really
President Trump, I
upset
believe,
there.
is.
I mean, what was he saying, Aaron?
So that's Steve Cohen, and he says to Gaetz, he says something that like Trump tried to start a war inside our own government with January 6th. Which, by the way, happy anniversary to everybody if you're celebrating.
Yeah, happy January 6th, everybody. It was just like, it was worse than Iraq. It was just like killing 1 million Iraqis, according to Steve Cohen. They almost did it too. It was like these low IQ rioters who are like being duped or like just led into their own political suicide. They almost took over the government with, they had high level support within the Pentagon. Trust me. It was really that. No, but I mean, that's what Steve Cohen is saying. He started a war within our government. Yeah. What does it even mean?
With a 3-hour riot led by the QAnon shaman. That's what he means. Yeah. But look, this is a talking point that Trump supporters will use, and there is some truth to it. It's true. Trump didn't start any new wars. You compare that to compare his record to Obama, for example. Libya, the dirty war in Syria, the surge in Afghanistan. But at the same time, it's not as if Trump didn't. I think Trump tried to start a war in Iran when he assassinated Qasem Soleimani.
Well, he caved to elements that wanted to do that, specifically Mike Pompeo and Benjamin Netanyahu, who were just working on him.
And if you ask Venezuelans, I mean, he certainly he escalated an economic war against them by trying to overthrow their government and imposing sanctions. So that's the part that I think that talking point from pro-Trumpers misses. But again, at the same time, imagine a progressive in Congress right now talking about how we shouldn't have a president who starts wars. I mean, that just wouldn't happen now because progressives right now are for proxy wars, especially the ones in Ukraine. The one in Ukraine.
I just think it's significant that he said that something that the left and right support for the betterment of our communities. You also don't hear that kind of rhetoric from the House progressives. You saw Ilhan Omar and AOC get heckled over their vote on two Ukraine aid packages, 40 billion and I think 45 billion. And they got heckled. And how do they respond? They call their hecklers Putin puppets and call them right wingers, and they attack them instead of saying, hey, you're right. Let's all come together. Let's bring people together across class, racial, and partisan lines against this war that's sucking money out of our communities into the pockets of Ukrainian warlords and the U.S. arms industry. Like, why is that so hard to do? But they couldn't do it. They sounded like McCarthyites.
Yeah, they can't do it because they've been completely co-opted, and still there's been multiple votes now for the Ukraine proxy war. There just was another one, and it's been pretty much unanimous. For the first time, Rashida Tlaib voted present, and AOC voted no. But AOC explained in a statement that it had nothing to do with Ukraine; it had to do with some border funding, some law enforcement funding on the border, which she campaigned against. So she voted against it because it was a part of a bigger. But so still no opposition yet from progressives, including Bernie Sanders, to this proxy war. The official price tag is over $105 billion now, at least.
Well, the House MAGA coalition has made a big deal about Ukraine aid. They've called to cut it off. And initially, and then we saw Marjorie Taylor Greene call to audit all military aid to Ukraine to determine where it's going and whether it's actually reaching the destination it's intended for. And Defense News, which is a publication that's very close to the arms industry. It's kind of like a Pentagon and arms industry trade publication. I mean, you look above this headline and they're advertising some big arms industry conference. McCarthy's troubled speaker bid raises questions about Ukraine. Many Republicans, as we know, support the Ukraine proxy war. Their views are represented every night by Sean Hannity or Ali North. The George W. Bush Republicans are heavily supportive of this. And Kevin McCarthy has resisted efforts to audit the aid, but he said, we won't give you a blank check. Then he rescinded those comments. He said that in November, he rescinded them in December. And so you have like the industry's fretting here. The regime is fretting about McCarthy actually making more concessions or failing entirely. And if you look at the alternatives that are being put up, who don't seem to have any chance, these are people who voted against the supplementals for Ukraine aid. Jim Jordan, who's not going to accept the nomination, is one of them, voted against the supplementals. So I think whatever happens here, you're going to see increased pressure on congressional leadership to start tamping down on these massive aid packages to Ukraine.
And maybe one or two progressives could join them. Like maybe just one or two. Is there anybody who calls himself a progressive, like Barbara Lee, who was the only lawmaker to vote against the AUMF to authorize endless war after 9/11? Maybe she could remember what made her famous for her principled stance. And
did you see her at Zelensky's speech?
I missed that. No.
She was sitting front and center with a blue and yellow dress on, a Ukraine flag themed dress. Whereas the squad didn't go. They didn't even participate. And over 80 Republicans did not go to Zelensky's address. I found that more offensive than the QAnon shaman standing there personally, but that's just me. I mean, the QAnon shaman wasn't asking me for anything. But yeah.
He was only asking, by the way, he was only asking for vegan meals after he got locked up in a cage for because all these January 6th rioters got locked up in indefinite detention for a long time, or at least some of them did. So the QAnon shaman's ask was for vegan meals.
Yeah,
that was his
at
ask.
least give him a plant burger for all the entertainment he brought us. I saw him there on that day, and I just felt like I was at Burning Man. He was shirtless. It was cold out. He was shirtless, wearing a Viking hat. And I didn't realize he was going to be this nationally significant figure. Jailed for 4 years. No, he shouldn't have been jailed. Maybe put him on parole or something. Most of these people should be let out of jail. Many people, millions of people should be let out of jail. We're wasting tons of money jailing people. Everybody gets jailed for too long for nonviolent offenses in this country. It's obscene. And, in the name of reducing mass incarceration, a lot of these January 6 people should be let out. I just want to say that it's absurd. And, progressives who say they're against carceral solutions should support that. And many of them were tortured. They were put in basically solitary for 23 hours a day.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Along with regular prisoners who never stormed into the Capitol. They were put in solitary for 23 hours a day because of the lockdowns in prison, the COVID lockdowns, which was just a form of torture, a huge human rights abuse that the left never said anything about. And many of these guys were in prison during periodic lockdowns, but then they were also held for 23 hours. They were beaten by guards. One January 6th, prisoner had his eye socket broken by a guard. It's
wow.
And there's a vigil there's been a vigil every week led by Ashley Babbitt's mother outside the prison calling for the release. I actually saw Ashley Babbitt bleed after she's shot, bleeding her last drops of blood as a stretcher carried her away. Should she have been shot? Well, I mean, seriously, there were other cops rushing up the steps to de-escalate the situation. What they were doing inside the Capitol was insane. What the rioters were doing inside the Capitol was insane. And she was crossing into an area where, the possibility is there of getting shot, but there were other cops rushing up those stairs to de-escalate. So anyway, that's my rant about January 6th. I think, for partisan reasons, this is being seriously overhyped, and it was like 3 hours of ignominious low IQ rioting that ended, and it's time to put this chapter behind us, but we can't because the security state must continually expand.
I think you put it best when on January 6th, I remember watching your coverage and you called the rioters the Ku Klux Clowns.
I mean, there were some seriously, I did hear some racist rhetoric there, and but it was just a clown show. Yeah. And, disproportionately, I saw disproportionate representation also of emigres from formerly communist countries who were just calling everything communism. And if you believe them, we were living in the Soviet Union. So anyway, moving along, I guess we're going to see a deal pretty soon on McCarthy. We will see some concessions. We never got those concessions with Pelosi. We saw the Democrats chanting for Hakeem Jeffries. Hakeem. He will be the first Black minority leader. But who does Hakeem Jeffries really represent, Aaron?
Wall Street. And it's amazing to see progressives who Hakeem Jeffries has openly tried to undermine throughout his career now welcoming him and clapping that at their glee in unanimously voting for him along with every other Democrat, when he's previously said that I'll never bend the knee to the radical democratic socialist agenda. Well, not only has he not bent the knee, but but democratic socialists are bending the knee for him. That's what they're doing now. And it's crazy to see.
Well, he also represents the Israel lobby.
Oh, yes.
I mean, here's this is the Guardian, but I mean, we could find his speeches at AIPAC. I mean, he's the biggest tool of the Israel lobby, one of the biggest tools of the Democrats. The Israel lobby's always looking for Black politicians to buy off. They actually have a program that's been funded by Haim Saban, the major Democratic donor and Hollywood zillionaire, where they send Black class presidents from historically Black colleges and universities to AIPAC, all expenses paid, and put them up in a nice hotel room so they can start grooming them because they figure they'll go into some influential position. The same has been done with Hakeem Jeffries. I remember he was put up first as there was a rally in New York, quote unquote, against anti-Semitism, and Ed Koch and Elliot Engel were there, and all the usual AIPAC tools and ultra-Zionist politicians, and they were rallying against Charles Barron, who was running against Hakeem Jeffries for his district in New York City. And Charles Barron actually represents the anti-imperialist Black radical tradition that emerged out of the 1960s. He has opposed sanctions on Zimbabwe very strongly. He's been an opponent of gentrification, a huge supporter of Palestine. And they were out there to brand him an anti-Semite. And this was part of the Hakeem Jeffries campaign for Congress. I also covered another interesting race for mayor of Newark, where Ras Baraka, the son of the Black radical poet Amiri Baraka, was running against Hakeem Jeffries' brother, Shavar Jeffries. And Hakeem Jeffries' brother was also there, the corporate plant who was put up by the private education industry who wanted to gut public education in Newark. It was like one of the last things that the Black residents of Newark controlled. They'd have everything taken from them except their public schools. And they wanted to put it in the hand of hedge funders. And Shavar Jeffries, that was his job. And he had these canvassers out who were paid for by like the Walton family and Gates and all the people behind private ed. And they were running around the city handing out flyers, but none of them were from Newark. They were literally bussed in. And they were kids who were let off school from charter schools. It was amazing to see. So that's the level of like corporate control over the speaker. But here's Aaron, AOC on Hakeem Jeffries, this kind of pro-war corporate tool of apartheid Israel.
It did not go unnoticed, shall we say, on the internet and elsewhere, that you were on the floor having some conversations with Republicans, including Matt Gaetz and Paul Gosar. Can you enlighten us at all as to what those conversations were like? And is there any hope that you guys work together to get Hakeem Jeffries elected as Speaker of the House?
You know, I think in chaos, anything is possible, especially in this era. You know, it is unlikely, but there's always a possibility. I do think that in terms of some of those conversations, I mean, listen, some of us in the House of Representatives are independent in certain ways from our party. And I do believe that in some of those conversations, there are things that are happening on the floor. These machinations are happening on the floor. And
that's strange optics.
The leadership of your party, in this case, the Republican Party, will be making claims in order to try to twist arms and get people in line. And a lot of times, information and truth is currency. So sometimes to be able to fact check some of the claims that McCarthy is making, whether Democrats are going to defect or not, et cetera, is important in order to keep him honest and to keep people honest in general. And so, you know, I think what was important today was to send the message that we were united behind Hakeem Jeffries as the now minority leader or as leader of the Democrats, and that there would be no defections, that Democrats are here.
No defections.
We're not going anywhere. And if they want to play ball, we're open to that.
So basically on the Democratic side, we're totally united and there's no defections.
AOC used to say that primarying Hakeem Jeffries was one of her top priorities. She said that
Really?
back, a few years ago. Yeah. That was one of her top priorities. That's what she said. And of course, it never materialized, like a lot of other promises coming from progressives. But this is where we're at now. And they seem so proud of the fact that they're all unanimous behind Hakeem Jeffries and not realizing that these far-right Republicans are exposing them to be craven and derelict in their duty, that these Republicans are using their leverage to extract something that fits their political agenda. And that's what the many progressives who voted for these progressives have been asking their elected lawmakers to do as well. And it's like, this is like almost a celebration of the fact on the squad's part that they didn't do that, as if somehow they're proud of that. You know, it's a strange sight.
Well, you know, we supported Forced to Vote and Jimmy Dore was right. That's kind of my conclusion from this whole saga, seeing all of what they're able to extract. And you know, Nancy Pelosi deserved to be shut down 11 or 12 times. Like, she deserved that. They had the votes to do it, and she deserved that. She shut down any attempt to defund the Iraq war. It should have been payback. Even if she was going to be elected speaker, but she wasn't treated to something like that. And before we go, I think Aaron, I wanted to get your thoughts on a new tranche of Twitter files that have come out in a Matt Taibbi thread, because I think they kind of validate a lot of what you've been saying over the years about Russiagate, pretty much since 2017. And also it shows how the media operates with how the media has been brought in as kind of enforcers of Russiagate. So this is a long thread. I don't even know where to talk, but here, this is a good one. Senate Intelligence Committee is asking, can we whip something together? Then BuzzFeed is threatening Twitter. This is from Yoel Roth, who's in charge of Twitter moderation. And he's basically being asked to whip something together for the Senate Intelligence Committee, which answers also to the CIA. And BuzzFeed is breathing down their necks, kind of as the attack dog for the Intelligence Committee, demanding that they do something. What are they being asked to do something about? And what is making Yoel Roth so anxious here?
So the key thing about Russiagate is that every major plank of it was generated by Democratic Party operatives who then used their influence to basically launder their conspiracy theories about Trump and Russia influencing Americans via major U.S. institutions, big tech, the FBI, and the media, who all were very dutiful in going along. So you have, just to summarize it briefly, you have the collusion angle, the conspiracy theory that Trump and Russia were engaged in some sprawling conspiracy and Russia had blackmail leverage over Trump. That was generated by who? Christopher Steele, who was working for the Clinton campaign via Fusion GPS and Perkins Coie, the Democratic law firm. Okay, so that's collusion. The Russian hacking allegation, which is the foundational allegation of Russiagate. Who's that generated by? CrowdStrike. Who are they working for? The Clinton campaign. Hired pretty much at the exact same time that the Clinton campaign hired Christopher Steele.
And FBI.
Then you have, and then the FBI then goes and relies on CrowdStrike's so-called forensics and relies on CrowdStrike's redacted reports that CrowdStrike redacts for itself. And CrowdStrike doesn't let the FBI access the Democratic Party servers that these Russians supposedly hacked, and nobody makes an issue out of that. And of course, years later, we learn that under oath, CrowdStrike admits that while they were privately claiming that Russia hacked the DNC, that actually they had no concrete evidence of that. That came out more than 2 years after the Mueller probe ended. A small little admission. So then you have this new aspect that we get more evidence from the Twitter files, which is the social media influence operation. So the claim is, and this emerged in like the summer of 2017, that Russia had waged a sweeping social media campaign to brainwash millions of Americans into voting for Trump, not Hillary Clinton. One headline in the Times said something like, Russian influence operation reached 126 million Americans on Facebook alone, right? Where did that come from? Democrats. We know this because there was an account in the Washington Post in 2017 that reported that Facebook initially did a review of suspect accounts around the 2016 election, looking specifically for the Russian government. What they found was that most of these accounts were just clickbait, seeking to attract viewers and then make money off of that, like attract an audience and then make money off it. Classic clickbait operation. And that's why most of their content wasn't even about the election. But then Democratic operatives got mad at that, and they came up with their own theories. This is according to the Washington Post about what really happened. And what they came up with was that actually the Kremlin had directed a massive social media operation to influence Americans to sway the election. So those theories reached the FBI and then reached Mark Warner of the Senate Intelligence Committee. And then Mark Warner personally flew out to Facebook and said to them, basically, you have to validate this. And Facebook changed its tune. And so now, bringing us to the Twitter files, this is exactly what happened with Twitter. So Twitter initially did a review looking for anything to do with Russia on their site, trying to find some accounts that could be linked back to Russia. They couldn't find anything. The only thing they really found was Russia Today, which is the Russian television network, which was a television network, but back before it was banned after Russia invaded. But that was just like a television network advertising its content and sharing its content. So that was what Twitter found. And Mark Warner said to them, that's not good enough. You need to find more. So what these Twitter files reveal is this desperate scramble to appease Mark Warner. And why? Well, it's obvious, because Mark Warner, as chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, has a huge amount of power. And these tech giants know that if they want to avoid excessive regulation from their point of view, they have to play ball. And if they're under pressure from the national security state and from powerful politicians, that's going to create the incentive for them to go along with whatever they want. And so the Twitter files reveal extensively how Twitter scrambled to come up with anything that could feed this Russiagate mania, kind of like the plant in Little Shop of Horrors. Just the Russiagate, insatiable Russiagate thirst that needed to grow. And actually, we have a clip, Max, if you want to play it, of Mark Warner complaining back in the fall of 2017, complaining after his initial meeting with Twitter that they weren't giving him what he wanted when it comes to validating these Russian social media claims.
I remember this from the time, just how telling it was. And well, here it is.
The Twitter team made to the Senate Intel staff today was deeply disappointing. The notion that their work was basically derivative based upon accounts that Facebook had identified showed an enormous lack of understanding from the Twitter team of how serious this issue is, the threat it poses to democratic institutions, and again, begs many more questions than they offered. Their response was, frankly, inadequate on almost every level.
So in other words, they just weren't giving them what they wanted, which was Twitter to say there are thousands and thousands of Russian bot accounts that are run by the FSB out of these IRA troll farms, and through Putin's chef Prigozhin, and they had meddled in the election. And there's actually, I don't have it in front of me, I don't have time to find it, but look in Taibbi's thread. There is an email, I don't know if it was from Yoel Roth, but a Twitter executive complaining that they can't give the intelligence committee what they want because it's not true, because all the accounts that they're finding, some of them have Russian phone numbers, but none of them are interested in the US. Some of them are involved in German politics, and they often appear to be real people. So they're like, what do we do? And then they start the debate internally. Well, we don't want to get hammered by BuzzFeed and get hammered in the media, so let's just essentially give them something to mollify them. And what they do first is they start sanctioning RT and Sputnik and say they're not allowed to take out ads and so on. And then they take all of their money that they paid to Twitter for ads, and they donated it, I think, to Robbie Mook's fake anti-disinformation center at Harvard. I mean, it all went there. So basically they're just like, here's a payoff, shut up, but it's all fake and we know it, but we're going to pretend it's true.
This really is one of the most laughable aspects of Russiagate, because at least with the claim that Russia stole the Democratic Party emails, at least you could argue that if that's true, I don't think it is true at this point based on all the evidence we have, but let's say it is true. You could argue that at least that might have influenced some percentage of the vote. Yeah, I don't think it was decisive, but some people might have read those Democratic Party emails that were stolen, and they show bias against Bernie Sanders, and they show corruption in the DNC by Hillary Clinton. And I'm sure some people read those and said, all right, I'm not going to vote for Hillary Clinton. But the notion here, let's assume for a second that all these social media accounts were run by Vladimir Putin himself. The notion that these social media bots and memes that were traced to Russia could influence a single person to do anything is such a joke, because if you look at the actual content, they're just dumb memes. There's a meme of Yosemite Sam. There's the meme I've mocked endlessly of like a guy with a problem with masturbation, and Jesus is consoling him. There we go. Buff Bernie.
Bernie. So this was a coloring book that was being sold by one of these IRA accounts, and I think they were just trying to increase engagement and maybe make money. I don't know what they were trying to do.
And this is what Mark
the
Warner
idea that this is Russian meddling that decided the election.
And it's a threat, like the way Mark Warner talks about it, it's a threat to our democracy. And Gerald Nadler was saying that this was akin to Pearl Harbor. And he says, yes, they didn't kill anybody, but they're trying to destroy our democracy with, for example,
here's how
Buff
BuzzFeed
Bernie
reported it. The woman who drew that Buff Bernie coloring book didn't know Russia made an ad. I feel violated and confused.
Yes. Such hard-headed
reporting. This is Hayes Brown, who's a former State Department and DHS guy. So he's basically, I think he's the one who was spearheading this whole campaign. And he's deeply connected to the national security state.
Yeah. And then there's actual figures like, a tiny fraction, and this is from the Senate's own reports, which I've written about. A tiny fraction of these memes and ads actually talked about the 2016 election. Most of them were just dumb memes that have nothing to do with politics.
Yeah.
So Russiagate is so laughable on every level. But at least with the allegation that Russia stole the emails, at least someone stole the emails, and at least those might have played a role. This one is just a complete McCarthyite, just like fabrication, and it's cartoonish because it's so dumb. The idea that these social media memes and bots could have influenced anybody.
I found one more hilarious clip while we were talking, and you actually tweeted about it at the same time, but I don't know, maybe if you, well, it's become more significant now, and you'll see why. I guess we didn't know in 2018 that this person would become so significant.
On the Hill by all the heads of every major intelligence agency in this country. They all said to a person that
no, it's her
now, and there is concern that they're going to affect this
weird
year's
Nina
midterm elections.
Jankowicz.
What are they doing now? Are they doing the same things that the Mueller team identified? Have they changed their MO in any way?
Yeah, I think that they're doing the exact same things. This is a tactic that they have practiced over more than a decade in Central and Eastern Europe, in countries like Estonia and Ukraine, certainly. And then we saw it more recently in the UK and in Germany. And what they're doing is just amplifying divisive rhetoric, again, in order to create more chaos and distrust in the system. Ultimately, a lot of people talk about hacking the election or hacking of voter rolls. We don't have any evidence of that happening yet. But what I'm most worried about going into the 2018 midterms is that voter turnout will be suppressed because people are going to be distrusting the system, distrusting that their vote matters. And that's the most dangerous thing and the most difficult thing to reverse.
So she's talking about, troll farms, and basically the idea was that these trolls or the bots made people not trust this system that Americans otherwise just totally trust and love and admire. And yeah.
Max, has your daughter gotten to the stage yet where she's afraid of monsters under the bed? Has that happened yet? She
is into monsters and like,
okay.
She's into wolves.
Okay. Well, all right. So this doesn't apply to her, but basically this is the intellectual equivalent of a kid fearing monsters under the bed.
Yeah.
What are the Russians doing now? Are they doing the same tactics with their Buff Bernie memes and their Jesus masturbation ads, or are they changing? It's the exact same thing. It's this completely baseless fear of a fictional villain they've created in their heads, and it's swept up all of them. And in fact, a requirement to be a part of the professional media class, to go on into fancy studios and speak like a professional, is to believe in this fiction. It's insane. Yeah, totally. It swept everybody. And this was going on for so long. And they did this every single cycle. So before the 2018 midterms, I remember there were headlines in the New York Times saying, the warning lights are blinking red and the threat level is akin to 9/11 when it comes to Russian meddling in the next midterms. And what happened in the next midterms? Nothing. I mean, the Russians didn't come, and we got this too in the most recent midterms as well. Remember that article in the New York Times like a day before this latest round, where the headline was Russia reactivates its trolls and bots ahead of the midterms. Well, what actually happened was Russiagate reactivated its trolls and bots.
Yeah,
and its trolls and bots are the people who work for the New York Times and other outlets like that.
Yeah, and they rely on these government-sponsored cutouts like. What is it, like the Center for Security, Alliance for Securing Democracy, which provide them with all of the so-called data, and it's all just manipulated garbage.
I swear to God, there's a new group. There's a new group popping up every single week. I can't keep track. Every week there's a new group with some weird name that acts to combat disinformation, and they're all staffed by the same people, former officials, big tech. And they're cited by the New York Times, the Washington Post as experts. And it's a great hustle. If you're looking for a hustle, consider being a disinformation expert. There's endless money for it.
Yeah. And in reality, you're just a disinformation propagator. I mean, I think because of the Twitter files, a lot of what we have been reporting and much of our work is being vindicated, and people are seeing in real time how the concept of disinformation was spun out in order to suppress any form of information, reporting, or narrative that interfered with the objectives of U.S. elites or the national security state. I mean, the Fauci files are coming out as well. And so it's popularizing the kind of mistrust or healthy skepticism of the counter disinformation experts that we've always had. I mean, people just see them as complete frauds now. Any critical thinking person, except people who are partisan Democrats, and even some people on the left, I see they're just like, "Why Elon Musk? Why is he doing this?" Like, which is pathetic. I mean, this is important. Whatever you think of Elon Musk, I'm not a fan of any billionaire, but
all of this happened before Elon Musk, and this is all factual, and it's exposed. I mean, Li Fang had a report about the Pentagon being involved in pressuring Twitter to promote its psyops when it comes to its influence operations around wars in the Middle East. And again, the outcry on the left was pretty negligible, and they're missing a big story. I mean, outlets that used to cover this kind of stuff are ignoring it, and whatever, but that's par for the course these days. It's just what it is. But
any mainstream outlet, Aaron, covered the Twitter files?
I mean, maybe I'm missing something, but the main thing I've seen was on like basically trying to attack Matt Taibbi and other people who've been reporting it. So, for example, the Washington Post, in writing about it, referred to Matt as conservative journalist Matt Taibbi, which is just such a joke. And then enough people made fun of them for that they edited it, but they didn't announce the correction. They just did a stealth edit. They didn't say this article has been changed, which is so cowardly. And the New York Times had this article about, again, focusing on personalities and Elon Musk and all these irrelevant things, at least are irrelevant to the facts that were disclosed. And they talked about how the role of Matt Taibbi has caused an uproar in journalism circles because he's a polarizing figure. And why is he polarizing? The Times explains, because Taibbi questioned the narrative of collusion between Trump and Russia. So that's why it's controversial, according to professional journalists who call themselves journalists, that Matt Taibbi is now reporting on the Twitter files, is because he dared question the dumbest conspiracy theory of all time.
Yeah. I was actually at the Collision conference we spoke at, Aaron, in Toronto, the one we were allowed to, the web summit we were allowed to speak at, because I guess like there was no Zelensky on stage. I remember I sat in one of the seminars and they had the editor-in-chief of ProPublica, which is one of these like Bill Gates funded mainstream investigative kind of public interest sites. And he actually said that the whole Russiagate thing was a sham, but he said it in a way that was much more subtle than you might. He just said, well, I think we just didn't do a very good job on the whole Russia thing. And much of what we did might not be looked at so generously in the future. And it's kind of amazing that there's this realization dawning on them, but it's always after the fact, because they got the investigations done. They got the impeachment done, which, by the way, Hakeem Jeffries was first appearing in. Then they can acknowledge that it was kind of bogus.
One of my favorite Hakeem Jeffries quotes comes from that first impeachment, so the whole premise of the impeachment was that Trump was trying to pressure Ukraine to come up with dirt on Joe Biden, right? So the impeachment team was asked, so what distinguishes what Trump allegedly did here from the Democrats, Hillary Clinton campaign, paying for manufactured dirt on Trump via the Steele dossier, which, a hugely consequential piece of dirt. And Hakeem Jeffries says, I'm not joking, he comes back and says, the difference is that it was purchased. So the Clinton campaign paid for it. Therefore, that dirt is okay in his eyes, which is it was so funny.
The Trump it's like the Trump campaign stole it or something. Like,
well, the claim was that Trump froze military aid to Ukraine. Used that freeze to compel Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden. Even though, and again, no one paid. It's a kind of case where no one paid attention to the details except for a few of us. But I wrote about this at the time. There was never any proof at all of a linkage between the freeze of the aid and the pressure on Ukraine. That's why Zelensky at the time said, I never felt any pressure. All of his aides never felt any pressure. No one could say when or how this supposed quid pro quo ask was demanded, because it wasn't. It actually wasn't. The freeze happened, but John Bolton explained in his book that actually Trump wanted NATO to pay more for Ukraine, and that was, in Bolton's view, Trump's main motivator. But of course, all that got lost because not only did that serve the goal of constraining Trump and undermining him from the point of view of the national security state, which found him to be too erratic and not a suitable steward of the global empire, but also it played the role of criminalizing diplomacy with Russia, cementing support for the then ongoing Ukraine proxy war, because the Ukraine war did not begin when Russia invaded, and helped lead us to the series of events that now gave us the Russian invasion and this current catastrophe of today.
Yep. And it was Barack Obama who first refused the demand to send Javelin missiles and other offensive weaponry.
Yep.
No, to send offensive weaponry beyond the Javelin missiles to Ukraine. Donald Trump was simply following in Obama's footsteps. This was kind of established U.S. policy and avoiding escalation that could lead to where we are today. And then the dam broke.
After he initially reversed it, when he first came into office, he initially reversed Trump's policy because he got pressured by everybody. And unlike Obama, he caved. And then when he finally undid his own decision and froze that military assistance for like very briefly, he got impeached. So there you go.
Yeah. So here we are. I think this would be a good time to wrap, and we'll return next week. We're really trying to make a point of doing these live streams weekly. I also do want to announce that since the Grayzone show, which is sort of a compilation of highlights and some original reporting interviews we do, First Pacifica Radio Network, which has over 200 affiliate stations across the U.S. It first appeared at KPFK LA on Tuesday at 5 p.m. It's an hour-long show we do. It has since expanded to WBAI, the flagship network, Free Speech Radio of Pacifica in New York City, 99.5. And our first show actually bumped Democracy Now! From the 6 p.m. hour on Wednesday, and we're now moved to Sunday at 6 p.m. every Sunday. If you're in New York City, you can listen or you can stream it live or listen to the archives at WBAI.org. And now that we're in the system, other affiliates across the country are picking us up. And my goal is that we get broadcast in Moscow every week. That's Moscow, Idaho, which has a Pacifica affiliate. So those are my life goals playing out.
Well, my immediate life goal is that everybody who's watching this and who's enjoying it, give us a like, because apparently that helps not only our self-esteem, but also the algorithm.
Yeah.
Which, although I'm sure, of course, it's an open market and everybody has the same shot. There's no suppression going on. So I'm sure the gray zone has equal opportunity. But just in case we need a little extra push, give us a like so that more people will see this. And I'm being facetious. Of course, we're being suppressed. So please help us break the suppression by giving us a like.
Yeah, I mean, we need to see the YouTube Google files. We need to see the Wikipedia files. We need to see the PayPal files, because the same thing is happening there. And actually, back to Pacifica, I did want to mention this, especially if you're supporting us on Patreon, because, you know, your support is allowing us to produce this show. My friend Chris Weaver's producing it every week. He's doing an incredible job. We're also getting help from Yasmin Zara, just wanted to shout them out. But there's a lot of opposition in the station to what we're saying and to our presence. And I see all the internal chats, and they're just losing it. And they're obsessed with this idea that we're in this red-brown alliance and we're trying to smuggle in fascism and Trumpism just because we're not on board with that phony partisan agenda. This one guy, Brad Friedman, is obsessed with taking down the gray zone and getting it removed. And he's trying to prove that, you know, we're backed by the Kremlin. We're in league with the Kremlin. And the funny thing is, this milquetoast liberal, Brad Friedman, was actually on Sputnik radio for years and was getting paid by Sputnik. So I don't know what he's talking about. It's really a case of projection there, but they're going crazy. So they're like sharing every smear piece about us written on some like random website within these chats. And we do have a lot of people standing up for us because they're sick of the Cold War liberals who've been infesting and taking over Pacifica. They want truly anti-war, anti-imperialist voices. And so I think it's a big achievement to get in there and to start bringing that network back to its roots. And of course, we'll always be here for as long as we're able to be on this YouTube channel. And you can also listen to all of these and a lot of our other interviews on my podcast on Anchor FM or Spotify. Just search my name, Max Blumenthal, and you'll find it.
Yeah, you know, as has been said before, Russiagate is a hell of a drug. And unfortunately, at Pacifica, a lot of shows, you know, that I grew up on, that in one case, the Democracy Now!, which I used to work on for 10 years, got duped by Russiagate, and it's led to a spillover effect where countervailing voices like ours, who challenge the Cold Warrior orthodoxy that Russiagate was based on, get smeared, and we get no longer welcome in progressive spaces that used to host this. I mean, there's many examples of this, and so I think it's great that we're trying to offer our voice. And what's funny is, as if we would never, ever, ever argue for any network to not air some other show. Who cares? They can do whatever they want. It's only the people who can't tolerate debate that want to censor and want to get people canceled and kicked out. So I'm disappointed to hear that's happening, but I'm also not surprised at this point, because that's the culture we're in right now.
Yeah, it is the culture we're in, but the culture we're in is no longer as prevalent as it used to be. You look at our views on the Grayzone, and actually MSNBC videos don't have as many views often, even though they're just this major corporate network. People are just turning away from it and tuning into their own algorithm. And in some ways that's good. It's good for alternative media, but why I think it's important to be on the radio and analog and just reaching anyone who happens to be tuned into that station, is that we're breaking through, and those people aren't choosing to be in their own echo chamber. They're not having it mined into their algorithm on Spotify. And so that's why I think that show is important. And yeah, we're going to have more investigative pieces up. So I think we're going to have a few huge ones up in the next week or two at the site. So look for that. And thanks everyone for supporting us and for joining. Thanks a lot, Aaron. And are you doing Jimmy tonight?
Yeah, tune in to the Jimmy Dore Show if you're watching this live in 45 minutes from now. We'll be doing live.
So yeah, go take a break.
3 p.m. Pacific time, 6 p.m. Eastern. Yeah.
Yeah. And don't touch any of Jimmy's stash beforehand.
I definitely won't. I definitely won't.
All right, I'll be watching. Peace, everybody.
Peace.